Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Looking for ways to help your clients become less susceptible to market fluctuations and peer influence? Get powerful personalization for every investor with Orion Custom Indexing, our tech-enabled solution for managing tax-efficient, customized portfolios at scale. Learn more at orion.com/custom indexing.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I'm joined by Dr. LaKeitha Poole, a performance psychologist who currently serves as Assistant Athletic Director of Sports Psychology and Counseling for the LSU Athletic Department and as an adjunct instructor and affiliate in the College of Human Sciences and Education and Department of African and African American Studies. Her current and former clients are a who's who, including the Miami Heat, Golden State Warriors, LSU Tigers, Portland Trailblazers, the NCAA, and the NFL. Wow. Welcome to the show, Dr. Poole.
That makes me sound super important, but thanks so much for having me.
Nobody comes on this podcast unless they're super important. So you're absolutely super important. And I want to start out. I've been excited about this for a minute because I think, like many listeners of this show, I'm like a frustrated athlete who wanted to be the catcher for the Cardinals, didn't work out, and I'm sitting at home yelling at the TV instead. And I wanted to start with a question for people like me. For the average person sitting at home watching sports, going, why didn't you make that kick? Why didn't you make that shot? What's the number one misconception about psychology in sports or human performance in sports? What are we couch potato Monday morning quarterbacks missing when we're watching sports on TV?
I think we're missing the part of just what you said, like the human part of it. So at the end of the day, our athletes that we watch, and we watch them, hoist up trophies when they win, but we also watch them walk into locker rooms feeling defeated. And that's because they're still people. It's the same way we feel in our everyday jobs when, we don't get that contract we wanted, or when things don't necessarily go well between a staff that, are working together to try to gain a win. And so I think a lot of times the misconception is that somehow, because we watch these athletes do these like super magnificent things, when they do those, we continue to still view them from that pedestal instead of on the day where they're just having an off day, or they didn't get enough sleep, or they just became a new parent. And we don't know those things all the time as people viewing them. And so we just forget, the humanity a little bit, the same way all of us who are, you were very kind to yourself. I usually call myself a failed athlete, and I wasn't, but I just did not have the bravery of some of these folks that I've had the chance to work with to keep going beyond my high school experience. I worked all the way through high school. And so we just forget that, those folks are people too.
Yeah, I think we do forget that, because I think one of the clearest evidences of this is the way I've heard people talk to athletes. I've seen this in the NBA playoffs as I've been watching this. People threatening players, people treating them as if they're other. Certainly seen this at baseball games. People using events that are happening in this player's life to kind of goad them or make fun of them. And it's like, we do forget they're just people that have good days and bad days, like you or I. It's playoffs time. It's NBA playoffs time when we're talking. The NCAA tournament just ended, and a number of teams that you work with or have worked with have won championships. The LSU Lady Tigers just won the basketball championship. You've worked with a handful of championship teams at the college and pro level, and I'm just interested if you see any sort of like common thread that runs through these winning teams. Like, what do they have in common?
I definitely think it's, a healthy team culture, and that starts with leadership, which is often, your coaches, your coaching staff. There has to be a vision there. And again, you would consider that with any team, right? Any team, whether it was in sports or not, there has to be a leader that has a vision. And then from there, you figure out how do you get those folks who have to go out there and play or participate to buy into the vision. And so what I feel like, particularly obviously for our LSU teams here, and then my experience last year getting to work with the Warriors, which was really awesome, and getting to observe them in that way was really seeing how they are all bought in and being able to then compare that to times where I've observed teams where I can clearly tell everyone's not bought in. And it's not necessarily because they don't believe in their ability or that, they're unprepared, but sometimes finding that exact sort of rhythm for everyone to be in sync is just hard. You got people from all over the world. You got people with different personalities, people with different backgrounds and upbringings. What motivation means to them looks different for every single person. And, if you start going sport by sport, you recognize that, a basketball team has 5 people on the floor at one time. But on the team roster, there could be 25 people on a roster. And so it's just always interesting to see what it looks like from the top down. And so when I get to work with teams, a lot of times coaches and coaching staffs will want us to work just with the athletes, but I usually also ask some questions of the staff and sort of say, like, what is the mission? What's the goal? What's going to be the way that you get these folks, particularly when it's collegiate, like they're still 18 to 22. So they still love social media. They still want to, have fun and experience college. They're growing and developing in ways that they haven't before. And that's hard. That's hard to do because athletes and college students for sure are just changing in how their attention looks and what holds their attention versus, at the pro level, there's also like to some extent less at stake. I think they buy in because it's like, I've now reached what now feels to me like the pinnacle, or like any of us who have terminal degrees, like we feel like, all right, that's the thing. There's nothing beyond this except for me to now go out and have fun. So it's easier to buy into a team culture because that's your job you show up to every day. And so the landscape's changing, obviously, with athletics, with NIL and all that stuff too. So of course, there's buy-in that's happening in different ways, but I definitely feel like the team culture has to be there. There has to be some level of just, being able to establish that and then build upon it so that you continue to just climb and elevate.
So this may be too obvious a question, but I'm gonna give it a shot anyway.
Ask it.
If you think about like every D1 basketball team, to use the example of the NCAA women's tournament, right? Like every team in that tournament, in some respects, had the same goal, which is to cut down those nets and to raise that trophy, right?
Yep.
But it seems to me that that's almost too obvious a goal, or too, like, when you talk about that why, when you talk about that team purpose, is it as simple as take home the trophy, or does it need to be a little bit more individualized and specific to the team?
I definitely think it has to be a little bit more individualized. So I do think there's a collective view, but I do think from just the experiences, still using like basketball as an example, there has to be sort of this piecing together. And ironically, our women's basketball team, that was their theme for this year, was like piece it together. And so that started out last year when they picked it. And so it was this idea of, we have all these folks coming together. Our team was made up of brand new people, basically a lot of transfers. It didn't, from the outside, it didn't look like that would ever work. How would that come together, within 9 months time, basically, to be able to then end up cutting those nets down. And so I do think a lot of individual work and self-awareness has to happen for athletes as a whole, or any high performers, even if they're not in athletics. Like, you have to have a level of self-awareness, again, of where do I align with what maybe the team goal and mission is? And if I don't, how do I, either create some buy-in to that, or how do I at least self-advocate for like where it's not fitting for me, so that my teammates know, or my coaches know, or support staff like myself can know how to like step in and help. And again, that's asking a lot sometimes for people who maybe just have never had to do that before. If they, when you start looking at those teams that make it to the Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final Four, they're the best of the best anyway. They can play the game with their eyes closed. And so it's more so about, what is mentally maybe blocking me from buying in, or maybe something interpersonally that could be happening, team dynamics, all that stuff plays into it too. But I definitely feel like there has to be an individual level of accountability as well. It's not just the team.
So if good culture is the cake, right? If that's the final product, what are the ingredients of that cake, right? Like what goes into that good culture? I've heard you talk about sort of buy-in. I heard you talk about accountability. What else goes into that? What else are the ingredients of that good team culture?
Yeah, definitely the buy-in and the accountability, but also I think, like I mentioned, that level of awareness, and that's both for skill, like, so skill development has to happen in every sport still, even at the pro level. Like, again, these folks have been playing their sports forever, but that doesn't mean that there's still, not room to grow or continue to advance or to maintain their skill development and advancement. I think then being able to recognize when something's not working and having to shift. So the same way, like if you are baking a cake and you recognize like, oh crap, I didn't put in, anything to make this cake rise, or I want an icing now on this cake and I got to make that in a separate bowl. I can't just throw those stuff into the cake mix and hope that icing will come out of that. It's being able to even sometimes step back and have the bird's eye view of where something isn't working. And so that just may be a form of like, internal evaluations and being able to sort of realign with missions and visions. And some folks don't want to do that in the midst of maybe a season that's already going. And, and I don't know that that's the best way, but obviously I think people could do it all. They can do it all kind of different ways. But in my thought would be, that's a perfect time to stop and pause and do that. We've had so many teams. I know everyone's thought about, like, for us, women's basketball at LSU, but our women's gymnastics team, for me this year, even though they didn't win they went to the Final Four, but they were number 4. And the season that they had, where they had to so many times regroup and kind of remind themselves of, here's the mission, here's my individual contribution. We had people going down left and right with injuries. It was a wild ride. But I think about, again, the theme that they picked back in August before all of this started was the climb. Never thinking they would literally have to climb to get to what felt like a summit at the end of it. And I don't think, they could have been any more proud to come in 4th place, because they knew what they had endured together and individually even to get there, because people counted them out a long time ago. And so I think it's those pieces, that you have to make sure that make up that cake, that make up the grit and the end result of what we see as a championship team.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of take the other side of this team culture coin now. Now, my beloved St. Louis Cardinals have the second worst record in the National League right now. And this is a team that had, last year's NL MVP. This is a team with the number 3 in MVP voting. And I mean, these guys are broken right now. They, you see all the signs. Downcast eyes, hanging heads, throwing bats, throwing helmets. If you were brought in to do an intervention with my boys and you needed to help this team, where would you begin? And like, what are sort of the levers that you would pull and the things that you would look at to try and help a team that was underperforming where you knew they could be?
Yeah, it's always fun in those scenarios. I know it's not fun for fans watching because they're watching their team feel like they're like tanking, but it's fun to get to go in and really do what we would consider both some team sort of assessing and like really understand, do we all see the breakdown the same? Like sometimes that's the problem. It's like everyone feels like everything is falling apart, but we all view the why behind it differently. And so a lot of times it's getting in, having those, whether it's, sort of team conversations, but then one-offs with certain people. Because every now and then on a team that seems like it's not doing great, there's still this like one person, 1 or 2 people that are still shining in spite of, but we're just not winning games. And so being able to sort of check in with those folks to understand, like, are we seeing, our quote unquote fail of not winning right now the same? And then what do we see, which could also be individualized, as the solution to it? And so bringing all that together, usually in a role like mine, would be to have those conversations and pool all of that information, whether that's through some sort of like, formal visualized reports that people can then take a look at. And then we have some discussions about it. or really being able to, depending on how much time you have. And when you're brought in season, you don't have time because they're playing and they want to win in the moment. But you do your best to move as quickly with making those adjustments for them by offering support and guidance and tools and going back to skill development again. And by skills, I don't then mean, because I definitely was not a baseball or softball player, but I could go in and help you understand, like, here's where you need to work on visualization, or here's where you need to work on mental prep for yourself, or here's you need to work on your routine development. And so those things, I think they take a little time, but it's really cool to get to really see if everyone's seeing the problem and the solution the same first, so that then you can figure out, like, yeah, where are we misaligned collectively, but also that is a great point to check in with people, internally, cognitively. That's one of the things I love about being sort of duly credentialed and licensed. So, I was a mental health practitioner first before I got into sports and performance. And a lot of times we don't realize how either those run parallel often, and sometimes, they intersect. And so being able to just have somebody who's not a part of the everyday team culture to come in and ask those tougher questions, sometimes it's just easier than a coach being like, well, what's wrong with you, or what's going on, or tell me what's happening, for those teams that maybe just aren't performing the way that they need to. So you almost have the same process, but it really is about, like, how people are seeing the problem for you to then figure out what's the game plan to move forward.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Like, people with different concepts of even, what's going wrong. You gotta start there and figure out, can we have a shared vision of dysfunction almost before
literally
before we move on to the next step. So, this is off script a bit, but how amenable are teams to this kind of thing? Because I'm like thinking about Moneyball, and it hasn't been that many years since we were picking players by their jawline and, like, their body type and stuff. Like, I think sports can be kind of archaic, and I know that mental health considerations can feel a little touchy-feely perhaps. When you're brought in to work with a team who's already kind of down in the dumps, do you find that they're usually receptive to this, or are they resistant to this, or is it sort of sport by sport?
I think I personally, I feel like I've been lucky that, in most cases I've been able to walk into a group that is at least aware enough, like, either we are having a problem and we need some help, or even a group that has won it all and they now still just want to plan for, like, what's ahead because they want to keep winning, and knowing that, yes, it can vary by sport for sure, but I think if nothing else, it's being able to prep them, which a lot of times, I'm fortunate, but the coaches and the other folks do that, and they'll say, we have this person, they're coming in, they're going to work with us on this particular thing, or sometimes they're like, we're going to let her come in, chat with you, we're going to step away and kind of let you all do your thing. So I've been lucky, because I definitely have colleagues and friends who have walked into probably what has been more hostile environments, because also at the pro level and even at collegiately now, again, talking about, the portal and all of that stuff now is a thing with, an athlete can win a championship and still decide to go to play at another school because they want one more year of eligibility or 2 more years, based on that. Those things are also, I think, measuring sticks, at least, of, like, what you're walking into. And sometimes it's positive, most times it's positive, but I think there are definitely times where you don't know if they are going to be receptive to, because it is still new. I definitely feel like performance-based techniques are things people have been using for a long time, but we now have a better understanding of the terminology and how to use that and how to flex it. And that looks different for a number of people. And so some people have had bad experiences, if we're honest. Like, there are people who have tried performance work or working with the psychologist just on their mental health, and it hasn't gone well. And so I'm oftentimes even particular about knowing why I'm coming in, and then having the staff introduce that concept using even different terminology to describe me, right? So sometimes I'm like, don't say psychologist, just say performance practitioner, or say, or say counselor, depending on the setting. And so I think that also, it helps to kind of know how you can at least, make things not feel so invasive that first time you're meeting a group of folks that you've never worked with before. It gets easier, but not in the beginning sometimes.
Yeah. So I was glad you mentioned visualization earlier, because sort of my caricature of a sports psychologist is someone whose job is in large part helping people visualize success. Now, the Mets got roasted last year because they were practicing celebrating a World Series, and they're like throwing their gloves up in the air and mobbing their teammates on the mound. And unfortunately, the cameras got it and they didn't win a World Series. But, there's also something to it, because in my part of the world, in behavioral finance, we know that the more vividly people visualize retirement, right, down to like the sensory stuff, like, okay, you're going to retire to the Bahamas. Like, what's the coconut going to smell like? What's the sunlight going to feel like on your skin? Like, when people get that granular with visualization, it actually has a material impact on their behavior. So am I out to lunch, or is visualization really part of what you do?
Yeah, no, you are totally on target. I mean, I think part of it is really recognizing that visualization and again, other skills and techniques, those all benefit someone seeking high performance. And so, the same way physically people talk about like muscle memory and those sort of things as a part of the agility that happens in a sport when something isn't going the right way, having a level of sort of muscle memory around visualizing something happening or being able to see it before you see it. Those things, they matter, because sometimes just that visualization itself isn't about the actual, again, skill development piece for an individual player, but maybe it's instead recognizing that like we just hit a really bumpy patch in our season based on injury, and like now I'm a freshman and I got to step up and do something that I didn't think I was going to even have to do this year. And so the visualization isn't about my skill and my ability to get out there and do it, but the fact that now my team looks way different than when we first got started with this season, and I need to still be able to see us hoisting up that trophy at the end, at least to get me going, because I now am scared out of my mind about what I have to do next. And again, not necessarily about what I have to do to get up there on the beam, the bars, floor routines, those sort of things for a sport like gymnastics. But at the same time, if I don't see it, then like who will? Because fans will be fans. The doctors and the medical teams will be honest about what they see, and it's usually not positive if somebody's getting pulled out. And so you have to be able to dig deeper and find something that will allow you to be able to still see the thing that you started out with when you felt like your team dynamic was perfect, or when you felt like everybody was healthy and well, or when nobody had wins or losses yet on the season. And so you felt like every opportunity was in front of you. You have to be able to do that. And so I think it's great. I know I hated that the Mets didn't pull it off in the sense because people saw it. But at the end of the day, I hope that they come back and they would do it again and again, because that's still a part of getting yourself prepped and ready to go.
Yeah. Do you have folks visualize like in the moment? Like, would you have a gymnast do it before she gets up on the, on the horse or the bars or whatever? Would you have a hitter do it before he or she gets up to bat, like right before?
We typically try to save that for practice, because we believe the idea of that you play how you practice, right? So practice should often feel as simulated to the game day experience as possible. However, a lot of times what we'll see instead of visualization, because that's done in practice, you'll see in the moment things like, if you notice, some athletes will they may close their eyes for a second, and instead of visualizing like the full out, they may take a breath, or they may make an exhale that feels much more like a release. And so in some ways that might be that person closing their eyes for that quick second and seeing, them hitting this home run, but that also could just be them trusting in their body and their mind to do what they've been practicing for it to do all week. So I usually tell people don't try anything too new. I'm a little superstitious around sports, so I'm always like, do what you always have done. But again, if you've practiced it, then there won't be this need to actually maybe walk you through the full sort of experience. You think about those people who just sort of, I don't know, they just like Steph Curry last night, 50 points in a game 7, first player to ever do that. And it's like, we have come to expect things like that, I think, of him. but I still am never not amazed when I watch some of his shots, like his shot selection in general. And there's a level of trust that he has in himself where he sees the ball going in and he starts running the other way before it's even gone through the net. And so it's like those sort of moments that I don't think he takes time each shot to visualize that ball going in, because he's already headed towards the other end of the court to get on defense. And so I think practicing is the best way.
So let's talk about it's the mention of Steph, right? So I was at the gym this morning. I was seeing the highlights from that because God knows I can't stay up late enough to watch a West.
Me either.
I was watching his highlights and he's incredible, right? Yeah. He's chewing on his mouth guard. He's walking away. He's mean mugging everybody. Like he's walking away before the shot goes through. I think about Acuna Jr. from the Braves, Tatis recently getting roasted for performance-enhancing drug use in the outfield, and he's doing a little dance. Like, is that kind of swagger in game a form of visualization? And it seems to me that it could go either way, because so much of my work with financial professionals is around encouraging humility. Because it's like, look, in financial markets, anything could happen. Like the minute you think you got it is like the minute, you're going to get humbled. How do you think about sort of that humility versus swagger continuum? And is that kind of swagger like a form of positive visualization?
Yeah, I love that you asked that, because I don't know that I've ever thought about the swag part being, there a level of confidence that you have to have that the thing that you went out there to do is just gonna happen. But I could totally see that would be a part of it. And I think that's where, going back to probably our earlier questions about, recognizing still the humanity of a person, and that, that level of swag and confidence only comes from somebody, I think, that has now built full trust in themselves to do what they came out there to do, still knowing it could not go their way, right? The 2 days before that, the Warriors didn't. They got blown out. And so I think part of it is really being able to recognize that the swag work, if it works for you, then great. If it works for you, that's awesome. But for some people, it may be that there's a level of visualizing that does create that level of humility to be able to sort of play the game and kind of, let that be. But I think that varies. I think about people like a Serena Williams or those folks who would show up and have what we would all view probably as swag, but that I think also looking at her sometimes she's incredibly calm in the midst of doing what she does. And so, or what she did, I know she's retired now, but being able to really, appreciate that. I actually love that. I think you have invented something new thinking about visualization, and that, that swag is that totally could be a part of, the subconscious part of them being I already have come to do the thing that I know to do. So why would I continue to stress and worry about it? I got another basket to make, or I got a goal to 10 on the other end. So I got to keep it moving.
Yeah, I do like what you said, because I could chew a mouth guard too, but I couldn't drop. So I think once you've put in all the preparation and all, the thousands of the lifetime, right? The thousands of hours of preparation and all the hard work and all the sacrifice, then maybe it is time for the bat flip or the, or the swag or whatever it is, for the Euro step rounding third base, whatever it is. I could see that as a form of competence. And I think some people, say respect the game, or they're kind of down on this. But to me, it's just sort of the ultimate faith in self and faith that you put in the hard work, not to mention fun to watch as a fan.
Right. Yeah. Total fun. In every way.
Yeah. So I think some of the best psychology in the performance realm is around this idea of flow. And so for listeners who may have missed it the first time, Dr. Jordan Hutchison, collegiate athlete himself, was on the show talking about flow for financial advisors. And there's a really great literature about this. Flow is sort of the psychology of optimal performance. Great book by the same title. by a gentleman called Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So just look up flow, don't look up his name. But what have you seen athletes do practically, right, to achieve flow states? I'm an Albert Pujols fanatic, and he would talk about when he's locked in, like the baseball looks like a volleyball, and like you just can't miss it. What practically have you seen, and how have you worked with athletes to achieve flow states?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of, my experience so far has been those athletes that really need to develop, when I think of flow, I think of sort of more pre-routines, pre-game, pre-competition routines. For some people, depending on, how they learn, and I think that's a layer that often gets lost. Particularly, I think I have to pay more attention to, because I work with college-age students mostly, who are also in an academic setting where learning is a key piece of them getting to play. And so being much more aware of like how they learn, how do they visualize? Are they, an auditory learner? Are they a visual learner? Do they need to have something tactile that they have to do every time in order to be able to understand that? I think about like my softball players in particular, when they're up for bat, many of them, I don't know if all of them do this now, but will, which a lot of, I think, hitters will do when they get up there, is go in and they step into the box, and then they also maybe draw a space for them to think about a way that they realign their bat with where that ball's coming in. And I think in those moments, that's not only them just drawing this box for the sake of knowing where to stand, but also them being able to have a visualization of like the actual degree of movement of a bat in a very quick and easy way. And so I think sometimes those are not things that we as fans, would give second thought. We just think like maybe that's a part of their swag. Maybe that's just something that they're, taking a minute to breathe in. And so I think those are sort of flow states in the sense of in the moment things. But a lot of it, I think for me and my experience has been watching those athletes who get into a mindset or a mentality leading up to competition. And so again, working with younger athletes, it's always, music or a hype video or something like that, where at the same time, it's them being able to go through, a breathing routine. With a lot of my teams here, we do progressive muscle relaxation, which is a technique of being able to literally work on what does it feel like for your body to be both tense and loose in those moments. Because a lot of times, as a ball is flying at you that you're expected to hit, most times you're holding your breath and you don't even realize it. And so it's being able to sort of help understand a level of awareness of like what you feel in your body and how do you either use that energy or if you need to in a moment, suppress that energy. And so I feel like all of that is a part of getting in the zone or being able to sort of think about, what is my individualized flow to make this happen. And then I think there's a team flow state too. I think, again, that energy before competition, to be able to think about the ways to work yourself up, to be all excited. And that's great when that happens. But there are sometimes moments where you can clearly tell a team is like not in sync. And maybe they didn't take time to all collectively get into whatever their zone is, which for me feels like everyone knowing what their role is for that particular game. Like if I'm injured, then my role is to cheer my teammates on, be there, be helpful in whatever way I can. But if I'm a starter, then maybe my role is to make sure that I've done my prep work the night before to get enough sleep, eat lunch today, and be in the gym warming up sooner, than everybody else, and taking my number of shots that I like to take before a game. And so, I think it could look all sort of ways, but I definitely think that, it's achievable with having a strategy and a plan.
Yeah. Nobody's going to confuse the excitement of my routine with like LeBron and chalk. But, I do find like there's just one or two practices. And for me, it's writing a to-do list, but like writing the goals I need to achieve the next day, the day before. Like, so today when my day's winding down, I want to write out on a piece of paper what I'm going to get done tomorrow. And then when I come down tomorrow morning and start working, I don't spend an hour spinning, looking at shoes online or whatever. I'm in it. I'm going, right? And look, it's not as exciting as a hype video. It's not as exciting as chalk. Like it's not, but I do think there's power in understanding that these flow states don't just occur without some preparation, you know?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And we are kindred spirits. I will be lost without my list that I have sort of waiting for me, the next day, just because there's so much to be done. And it allows me to have a level of like internalized accountability, because if I sit down and I see that list, like you said, I can't just venture off into something else, because then I know, well, the clock's ticking. I got to get into my rhythm and my flow before this day gets going. And then I look at the end of the day and I feel, crappy because I didn't get anything done from my list that I had prepared and ready to go. So I 100% agree with you that, we all probably should look for that in different ways. Maybe it's not a list for everyone, but figuring out what your thing is critical to performing well in whatever capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. Flow, one of the things they talk about in the flow research is being sort of so locked in on a task that you just lose track of time, and time's kind of flying by. And for me, that doesn't happen without a serious amount of preparation, but your mileage may vary. It's going to look different for you. Okay. So let's talk about the opposite of flow now. We're going to talk about the yips, right? So I first became interested in the yips with Rick Ankiel. So Rick Ankiel was a Cardinals pitcher, like young phenom pitcher, great arm. And he was brought in, with 2020 hindsight, we know now, he was brought into a playoff game sort of green. Like he was brought in sort of underprepared. He had spent the year in the minors, and then they bring him in like for the NLCS or something. And it's crazy. Like you go from playing in Iowa somewhere to now being in a stadium with people screaming in the playoffs. And he went from being one of the most exciting pitchers in baseball to a guy who could not get the ball within 50 feet of home plate. I mean, he was throwing it all over the backstop, hitting people like crazy. And he had to actually go back, reteach himself baseball. And he actually, to his everlasting credit, remolded himself into a power hitting outfielder, which is not exactly like an easy thing to do. But I don't golf, but I know golfers talk about the yips. You've got Steve Sachs and Chuck Knobloch and all these people in baseball famously who couldn't throw to first base anymore after decades of being exceptional fielders. It's such a fascinating phenomenon, like how you could go from being one of the best in the world at something to then seemingly have no capacity to do it. What is the psychological mechanism that kind of accounts for the yips?
Yeah, so I actually love talking about this, particularly with our baseball and softball players here, is because I get to nerd out a little bit on the psychology side about neuroplasticity, which is basically your ability to be able, to, yes, learn something, master it, but then to have to make adjustments almost, out of the blue. And it's not always tied to just happening at random, but it helps to make it clear for athletes, this idea of like, what happens when I feel like, a lot of my athletes will say that they feel like their brain has just like locked up, and for whatever reason, their coordination now just doesn't even work anymore. And so it's this idea of being able to, almost take all the pieces that go into skill development and success there to break them down, which is exactly what you just described, like with Rick Ankiel, like being able to think about how do you take all of these pieces that go into something that for years and years and years you just did without a thought, almost probably unconsciously, and now have to sort of think about either reevaluate or totally regroup what your methodology is, what your strategy is. And again, that happens in sport, but it happens really to all of us a lot of times, where we are put in a place where we have to literally break down everything that we knew in order to rebuild something very different. And this is just about, again, from a neurological perspective, like the way our brains develop is that there's a certain point in time where everyone always talks about, like, kids do crazy things up until a certain age because their brains aren't fully formed. And it's like, that may be true in essence, but at the same time, we all still have these things that we just get used to doing to the point where we're no longer actually working at them or working at stretching or thinking about it or working on growing and feeding our brain to the point where that moment where maybe we need to lock in, which is now compounded with, just like in this example you gave of being now in a new environment, a new, team setting, the pressures of that, which is, it's normal and expected to be anxious, but literally your brain is almost trying to process both the change that's happening to you and that you're being exposed to, while also recognizing that this thing that you've done that you didn't put a lot of thought into anymore, somewhere you've had a switch where now you want to be able to think really intently about that. And your brain's like, yeah, not today, it's just not happening. And so, it's been pretty, I think, pretty cool to watch folks work through that, but it is so frustrating for a lot of athletes to be able to sort of figure that out, especially if they maybe don't have someone to help them think that through. They, especially again, if it happens mid-season or if it happens at a time where they really need to feel like they need to perform, it can be infuriating. And you do see some folks don't come back from it, for a while, because that emotional part of it gets in the way of even being able to think about, well, how can I break this all down into the more bite-sized experience and pieces? So it is the worst. It's one of the most painful things as a practitioner to watch like a player go through, because you know how hard they work and you know how hard they're working to fix it. And you don't really always get quick results with stuff like the yips. It makes me sad. I don't get sad about a lot of things, but it's one of those things that I'm like, ugh, it's hard.
Yeah, I was so glad Ankiel was able to come back sort of with this second iteration of his career, because forever it was just this sob story about there was this guy with infinite potential and he just blew it, and he came back and hit some, became a power hitter, which I don't know how he did that. That's Shohei Ohtani level stuff. Yeah. And that's pretty incredible. So break it down to its constituent parts, beginner's mind, and almost relearn every constituent part of the motion then.
Yep, bit by bit, right? Just take on more than you can chew, right? In that moment. And again, feels elementary, feels frustrating sometimes for someone who's done something maybe their whole life, but definitely helpful in being able to just hit. I call that our hard reset, like we do with our phones. Instead of just turning it off and thinking you're going to turn it off, turn it back on, and it's going to be cool. It's like, no, you actually got to hold it a little while longer so that it actually resets the part that, we don't get to see behind the scenes. And so, bit by bit.
Interesting. Well, this has been fascinating. Last question. Most of us are never going to be called on to hit a 3 with time expiring, or
definitely not me. Definitely not me.
Not me, except in the driveway with my son when I count it. Yeah. But what are one or two practices or ideas from sports psychology that you feel like have some application to the world of business or everyday life?
Yeah, I think consistency and those things. So everything I know we've talked about a lot, but like things like whether it's if you're a list person, if you're someone who needs to be organizing your thoughts, consistency with what those practices look like. So make that list every day, or make sure that your calendar is where it needs to be at the start of the week, so you don't have to have that on your mind the rest of the week. Being able to just be very intentional and consistent, I think, is the key. Understanding, kind of the flexibility that you need to have to be able to be a high performer comes with knowing what your goal is and what you have to achieve. I think a lot of times in our day-to-day, I know for me, just as an employee and as somebody, a business owner, like you get into this idea of like, okay, I know how this looks. And we forget that, just like we were talking about earlier, we're human. So there are parts of me that 2 years ago was my vision for my career, for the things that I want. And 2 years later now looks very different. And if I don't make time to check in on what those are and then explicitly like lay them out, and whether that's mapping them out for sure or whatever people's process is, but like you have to make time to do that and do that regularly. I think some folks, again, get into, which we talk about with their flow, but they forget that sometimes flow can be interrupted by life. And so being able to just find time to check in, obviously that maybe even fits with just taking care of your general mental health and mental well-being as a whole, for sure. And then I think just understanding like, what is it that still drives you towards that thing. So if it's in finance, is it the financial goal that you have? Is it retirement? Is it really being able to think intentionally about, generational wealth building for your, for your family? In sports, it's the same thing. Like, is the goal the fact that like we've never won a national championship, and now this is the time to do it. And so when you have that thought, you're able to lock in, and now your performance not only just becomes this very like ambiguous broad thing, but towards something that now gives you a little bit more of ways to create objectives to get there. And you can still pace yourself on all that, but those would be the things that I feel like you have to at least be consistent with yourself. You got to be able to know what your goal and mission is, and then create, an opportunity for yourself to then just go after it. And you hope for the best, because at the end of the day, a lot of sports and athletics is still some good luck in there too. It just happens that way sometimes.
Yeah, it's incredible. The thread that runs through all this is just that vivid why, right? That purpose, good for individual performance, good for team, good for business. I hear that message so much. Well, Dr. Poole, you're incredible. If people want to follow your work, if they want to follow you on social media, what's the best way for people to follow all the big stuff you're up to?
Yeah, I kind of log my story for fun because that's my like escape a little bit on Instagram. So you can follow me at LaKeitha P on Instagram. And then, of course, if interested in more details about the work that I do through my private practice, mostly is www.smalltalkcounseling.com. And of course, if you go on LSU's website, my face is all over there. So you'll find me there. But also lsusports.net/LaKeitha Poole too. So that's also an easy way to find me, connect, and, let me know if you guys have questions.
Yeah. Well, hey, thank you again, and go easy on Auburn this year. Okay.
We're going to try, but we probably won't try. But
all right. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.